Welcome to Chapter 11 of Geography for Quebec Community College, the geographic profile of the United States and Canada. This particular slide starts with our lovely data table showing the three countries in the region we're talking about here, Canada, Greenland, and the United States. Without question, the United States stands head and toes in money and population in this region. Most population, the wealth, obviously. This region tends to have good HDI development index, highly urbanized populations, and a very large swaths of land. Canada would be large United States, but Greenland's no slouch either. Yeah, this right here kind of goes over what I talked about. Although the United States and Canada are around the same size land-wise, populations are incredibly different, lending to Canada having a very low population density for its area, and the United States, by comparison to Canada, high. That being said, the United States itself is not very densely populated compared to other parts of the world. Most Canadians, it says 90%, I think the number is actually higher nowadays. Most Canadians basically live on the US border or right next to it. Every major city in Canada is on or near the US border because northern Canada is just tundra and desolation. That's essentially the idea there. Both overwhelmingly urban city dwellers, and yeah, I imagine I don't have to explain a lot of United States and Canada to most of the students of this class. You are familiar with the countries. We include Denmark in here simply because, well, you're going to put Denmark. But there's your picture. I'm sure you've seen this map before. I don't need to land too long on it, with the exception of pointing out that there are a lot of archipelagos and islands in northern Canada, and they're basically all uninhabited. But there's a lot of them, and they're rather large, as you can see. Population distribution, again, unsurprising here. If you look at this map, you could probably name the cities in every one of those red dots in the United States, right? Austin, San Francisco, LA, Chicago, Detroit, Pittsburgh, what have you, right? Atlanta. Noteworthy here is that it basically dries up population-wise going north. Again, the vast majority of Canadians live on the United States border and near to it. Cartogram is definition of pointless here. Oh, let's mute that mic there. And here is our populations of the cities. We only have two cities. I think at this point we have three cities above 10 million people. That'd be New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. But there are still quite a large amount of people here. Notice on this list, Canada appears twice at 11 and 16. Very low on the scale. Not a lot of people live in Canada, as we talked about before, compared to the United States. And with the exception of New York and LA, most of these cities aren't super large. A lot of the other regions we talked about had lots and lots of cities, at least in the tens, if you will. America has three: New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. I do not believe Washington's at 10 million yet. Boston and San Francisco, I'm very sure, if not either. So, not a lot of overly populated cities. You've heard the phrase before, America is a nation of immigrants. From here going forward, we're going to talk about these slides. We're talking about America, the United States of America, unless I explicitly say Canada or Greenland. So just make the assumption these are basically all US slides for here. North America is a nation of immigrants. The people that live in America, I'm sure you're not going to be very surprised to hear this, are not native to the land. The Germans have been living in Germany for 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years, right? Egyptians have been living in Egypt for thousands of years. The Americans have been living in North America a couple hundred years, right? So when we say we're a nation of immigrants, it's very much a true statement. Each year, nearly 1 million legal immigrants arrive in the U.S. a lot of them, and a smaller portion, but still some do arrive in Canada. We got a lot of guest workers and stuff like that. And unsurprisingly, given the fact that you've lived in America, you're probably familiar with the issue we have with illegal immigrants. There are a lot of people that come to America that don't follow the quote unquote proper channels. The reasons why that is, we'll dive into a bit more as we go forward. And it is in and of itself, as I say this all the time, this is a very deep subject. A few slides in this presentation aren't going to do it justice. Flow chart for migration patterns, 1990 to 2000. This is not very highly changed. China, India, stuff like that probably be increased. But yeah, a lot of people come to America. A lot of people specifically from Mexico down there. But this, I will remind you, is going to be known immigration. You can't really count illegal immigration by its very definition, right? Yeah, lots of people come to America. Not a lot of people leave America. Very much a immigration, pro migration sort of conversation. Jacob, question?
So I see that there's apparently quite a lot of Asian immigration into Canada,
Yes.
but not a whole lot of European immigration into Canada. Do you know why that is?
Well, you'd have to ask them, but there's not a lot of migration into Canada, full stop. It's not compared to the United States, right? That being said, there are some large indigenous subcultures in Canada for Asian immigrants. There's, Asian sections of Toronto and stuff like that. So I'm assuming those are all very familial immigration. So the similar reason to why most people migrate because they want to be with their families. There are established Asian populations in the Philippines and China, for example, in those large Canadian cities. That'd probably be the reason why. It is noteworthy when you look at those European cities of the countries. Germany's the only one that's in regular good old Europe. Poland, Ukraine, and Russia are Russian or semi-Russian states. And I think you could also clump a lot of the satellite countries around Russia into that conversation. So Europe as a Europe isn't really migrating out very fast. You got something else?
Oh, no.
Oh, okay.
Just
Sorry.
saying thanks.
Yep. Andrew asked a question. Are there any countries that more people are going to than coming from? Yeah, that'd be an immigration versus emigration conversation, Andrew. And America, of course, as of the way this slideshow, and you could argue still today, most people come into America, and the places where they leave, such as Latin America and Africa, have large emigration issues where people leave. More people leave Mexico than enter Mexico, for example. All right. So it's a little bit of the immigration side of it. Let's backtrack a bit. And again, keep the immigration in the back of your mind as we go through these other slides. And the reason why people come to America in these stupidly big numbers will make a bit of sense, especially if we compare it to the other regions we've talked about. United States, remarkably diverse natural environments. Arguably one of the most diverse countries by itself in the world. Spectacular landscapes, right? I'm sure we've all been in a national park at some point. Beautiful. It's important to consider how these landforms have promoted or hindered human use and climates around there. When we talk about the landforms of the Americas, you can talk about the Canadian Shield or Greenland, but really you're probably talking about Piedmont, Great Plains, the Rocky Mountains, the Great Basin, the Arctic Coastal Plain, the Pacific Mountain Ranges. Lots and lots of diversity when it comes to this region in the United States in particular. You can basically find any climate, any type, any location in the world within the continental United States, to a lesser extent, but similar Canada, right? You want to go to Arctic cold, run up to Alaska. You want to live in a tropical paradise? Go over to Hawaii, right? You want to live in a big bustling city? Go to New York. Like every possible thing you could want to do in the world, you can do in the United States, which is, you could argue, one of the reasons why the United States is in the position that it's in. Coming along with this conversation of the vast variety of this region is, of course, natural hazards. We get when we get to it, we got so many different climates and biomes, we have the natural hazards associated with them. We are a country that simultaneously has to deal with hurricanes, earthquakes, tornadoes, and blizzards. Every year, a different part of the country has to deal, and hundreds of people die every year from those various things. That's a lot of diversity and destructive potential that is not really shared many other regions of the world. And then on top of that, droughts and volcanoes can pop up when need be. Mount St. Helens in the 80s, right? The Dust Bowl in the 30s, post the Great Depression. All these things can play with each other and really go to show the vast variety of landscapes and topography in this region. This climate map is a very large swath, right? You get your subtropic and your humid climates and your sort of comfortable weather off to the east. You got the desert in the center, the mountains, you got tundras and ice caps, huge variety of climate. Huge variety of climate naturally falls into huge variety of biome. Only thing missing here is rainforest, and you could probably argue, if you really wanted to, that certain parts of Florida are rainforests already. The Everglades, that's pretty rainforesty down there. They consider that savanna, I guess. But yeah, large biome diversity due to large climate diversity. Large biome diversity leads into large land use diversity. You have large swaths of farming, of useful grain farming, dairy farming, Mediterranean farming, mixed farming. What we're noticing here is in the other slides, especially in the less developed countries, we talked about like Africa or Latin America, Oceania, large swaths of essentially land where they try to grow stuff that they can't grow. And that's not really something that happens in America. We have very firmly established what grows well where, and we've been able to use that to our advantage. Eric says, speaking of the Dust Bowl, I've been reading articles lately saying we may have Dust Bowl-like conditions coming back very soon. Is there anything you can tell us about that? So the Dust Bowl in the 1930s post, if you ever seen Gone with the Wind, not Gone with the Wind, Wizard of Oz, sorry. If you ever seen Wizard of Oz, that took place more or less during the Dust Bowl. The bread belt of America, basically, your Nebraska, Kansas, what have you around there, went through severe droughts and basically nothing grew, right? And there's arguably a twofold reason for that. One, if you're going to have a drought, you're kind of just going to have a drought. Not much you can do about that. That's a climate scenario that it's got climate change associations with it. It's got just the world wants to give you a drought now. Africa, I believe, is going through a drought right now, large swath of Africa. And two, there was not proper farming techniques going on, not having crop rotation, not taking care of your soil. So when you had droughts and high winds, the soil could pick up and flow around, and the Dust Bowl is called Dust Bowl because there was lots of dust, because they didn't take care they did not take well care of their soil, of the ground that was growing the plants. So Eric, to answer your question, what is a Dust Bowl coming back? The drought side of that, it's very likely. Again, that's not something we can control. The dust side of that, the poor land management part of that particular drought, is more well managed. We take better care of our soil now, so the chance of things drying up and swirling up and causing all this chaos, I would argue, is less likely. Then again, I'm no botanist. This is not my field of expertise, but that's just how I would answer that question. Andrew points out that Michigan has the lowest potential for natural disasters compared to the 49 states. I suppose, yeah, we don't get, what was that big old list, right? Michigan does not have earthquakes, does not have hurricanes, does not have, if we do have tornadoes, they're barely ever, right? Medium risk there, that's questionable. Only thing we really get around here is blizzards. So yeah, go us. No mountain, no volcanoes, low chance of drought given all the hills. So yeah. Climate use, right? We went over this list already. Lots of variety of climate. Like every climate that we talked about in previous regions all exist in the region we're talking about here. And they exist almost exclusively in the continental United States. Once you get into Canada, you're basically all subarctic and tundra. So, topography region, right? And again, think about, I said before, keep migration and immigration in the back of your mind through this presentation. Why do you think people want to come here, right? That you can find something just like home in any part of America if you really want to look for it. Migration, cultural, historical geography began. We don't really know when people crossed the Alaska-Russia land bridge. I can't remember the name off the top of my head. When they crossed that land bridge, came to America, we don't know for sure when that happened. We keep finding more and more evidence that people here further and further ago than we thought. This says possibly as early as 33,000 years ago. I've heard 40s, 50s, thousands of years ago when Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, what have you, came from Asia to the Americas. Bering Strait. Thank you, Aaron. I should know that better. Yeah, people started coming over here tens of thousands of years ago, and they started settling and forming civilizations. As I talked about Latin America, we have an issue wherein these civilizations that came to America didn't necessarily keep records as well as, say, the Chinese or the Egyptians or Indus Valley settlements. So it's harder to track what they did. Likewise, when we get to Europeans didn't do a good job of keeping, right, the what records there were have in museums, right? Christopher Columbus didn't come over here and take all the text or whatever he had and place them in nice boxes for safekeeping. So when we put timescales around ancient native peoples of the Americas, you put asterisks around most all these numbers. When did the Anasazi start? We say 1200 because that's how far back the for sure stuff we have goes, but it probably goes back a lot further than that, right? People have been here since 30,000 BCE. I get the feeling that they had houses at some point between 30,000 BCE and 300 BCE. So, but yeah, lots and lots of native cultures, lots and lots of very impressive works, just like throughout the rest of the world, right? Very cool stuff. Lots of native language families arrive in this part of the world. This map should look familiar. This is your native languages, and there are tons of them because there were lots and lots of different peoples and lots of different societies back in the day. By back in the day, I mean pre-Columbian times, right? This is noteworthy, however, because all these cultural areas and all these language families don't exist anymore, right? When we looked at this map of Europe, all those languages, all the names of the languages sounded familiar because they were French and German and Polish and stuff like that, and they're all still relevant. America is a nation of immigrants. None of these peoples live in these regions anymore. Right? Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. They came over here. You've seen Pocahontas to tame this frontier and civilize the savages. And what that meant is they came over here with their guns and their diseases, and they took what they wanted. Stop me if you've heard that story before in this class. The Europeans show up, decimate the native population, do what they want with the land, and hey, that's how it goes. Yeah, same song, different dance. Sad as always. Native American peoples tend to, in Canada, refer to themselves as First Nation peoples, an acknowledgement of their pre-Columbian claims to the land. And Canada has done a lot better job of sort of working with its First Nations people to come to some sort of equitable agreement. Canada ceded a quarter of its total area to the Inuit people in 1999 to create their own territory. Granted, that's the Inuit people, which are Arctic. You can see at the top here, where's that pointer button? There it is. You can see up here, Inuit, 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 Inuit up here. So was this really a kind thing Canada did, giving up this essentially useless land to the Inuits? Well, it sounds nicer than it is, right? But have you heard of America giving up its land to any Native Americans recently? No, you haven't, right? What do we do with Native Americans? We drop them on reservations. Any of you familiar with the Gilgit campuses, I'm sure have been around a federal Native American reservation. And as said here, very poor communities plagued by high rates of incarceration, alcoholism, drug abuse, depression, broken families, teen suicide, unemployment. The only thing arguably positive that comes out of reservations are casinos. So how's this really going for you, right? Yeah, Native American populations are still very prevalent in the United States, but where they once lived literally everywhere, they have now been put into these small, tiny little cramped communities. The history of this process is just as depressing as every other process we've talked about, with how Native peoples were treated by colonizers such as Europeans. Again, that's something you should look into yourself if you want to know more. It's beyond the scope of this class. But suffice it to say, right, they all have these terrible names for a reason. Trail of Tears, and what have you. So, yep. Of course, this leads into the European settlers, literally waves of European settlement in North America, for many reasons: colonization of land, expansionist efforts, resources, religious persecution, what have you. All these reasons why people came from Europe to the Americas. When United States and Canada became independent, they also had expansionist goals. Of course, when there was the original 13 colonies that declared independence against Britain, right? The West was not yet settled at the time of the American Revolution. Happy 4th, posthumously, everyone. So America also pushed its way over. We had things such as the gold rush in California in 1849 that drew people from the established East Coast of America off to the West in search of their riches. The Homesteading Act basically allowed people to claim massive swaths of land for no money because they wanted people settling these regions and arguably pushing out the natives that have been living there for thousands of years. Canada had a Multiculturalism Act. I don't know much about that, sadly. Here's your territorial expansion that I'm talking about, right? 1783, America had its particular swath of land, and then over time, it bought or beat up the people that were living in that particular part of the world and grew and grew and grew and grew and grew. Keep forgetting. Miss Bell, question?
Yes, I had a question about the last slide.
Okay.
When you said they were able to buy 160 acres of land for $10, is that $10 like how it is currently?
No, that'd be $10 in their time. So that would be like a week's pay or something like that.
Okay.
It was still incredibly cheap Essentially, the Homesteading Act, the idea behind the Homesteading Act was there are tens of thousands of acres out here, right? No one's living out here. Go out there, set up a farm, do whatever you want, and we have to buy it. Technically, you have to buy it from someone, so we'll sell it to you for nothing. That's what happened.
Oh, okay.
So when you see something like Little Home on the Prairie or any of those old shows of people living in these like vast open lands, they got them for super cheap. Not like $10 in today's money cheap. Not like, oh, do we want 100 acres or do we want, a burger from Burger King? Not that cheap, but still a lot cheaper than you would have paid for the land, say, in Virginia.
Okay.
Yep. So, yeah. Again, each of these conversations is its own can of worms. Losing a purchase is very contentious, right? Hawaii's annexation, Alaska, we bought that from Russia. We fought Mexico a bunch of times over land. Texas was its own country for like 2 weeks or something like that back in the day. And Canada, of course, has its own extensions as well. A lot of what Canada did paralleled with the United States did in terms of getting land cheaper than it should have and kicking out the natives that live there. But Canada arguably has also done better recently in rectifying that situation. Your ethnic groups of the area, mostly are European, again, unsurprising, right? You can see beyond that Europeanness, you do have Hispanic and African large populations down here in the south of the United States. And that, of course, comes from what the Africans came from the Confederate States, and Hispanics are around Mexico, right? These orange slices up here, these are Native American populations. That's a lot more limited than it appears. Here is a list of your European, not your European, but your immigration groups throughout time in your major ethnic groups. You had native peoples, pre-Columbus dominant, and then the French started moving over here, took over the southern United States, what have you, took over a lot of Canada, settled all that. United States moved around, and then you had these big chunks of Europeans for many years moving over here, essentially to find a better life, right? The Statue of Liberty, give me your tired, you're hungry, yearning masses for freedom. I can't remember the exact phrases, but that was a big movement over here. You can find very interesting stories of, say, Irish immigrants. The Irish were incredibly hated when they first came over here. I'm sure your grandpa can tell you a few Irish jokes, right? And that is the reason for that. Africans, of course, came over through the slave trade, and then post-slave trade, since it wasn't legal to have Africans as slaves, they instead brought over Asians. You of course, it's famously well known that the Chinese laborers were the people that built the Transcontinental Railroad, and your opium dens and all those other terrible racist cliches. And then as you broach into the 1900s, you run into your wider variety of less developed countries sending their people over. Your Hungarians, your West Indies, your Latin Americans, your Vietnamese, your Filipinos. And all of these times coincide with something that happened in their country. The Vietnamese showing up from the 70s, well, that's after the Vietnam War, right? The Greeks in the 50s, that was after chaos happening after World War II in the country of Greece. Filipinos in the 90s after large civil unrest in the Philippines, things along those lines. So people love to come to America from all over the world, especially when they have problems. You're refugees, if you will. Most all the post 1950s large ethnic groups that came to the Americas were predominantly as refugees. America still technically is a majority European, majority Caucasian, majority white country. That being said, it's fastly changing. And as the slide says at the bottom there, by the 2040s, non-Hispanic whites are thought to be less than 50% of the population. It's the changing landscape. People come to America, these things happen. Different urban landscapes in the environment. Here we have, this looks like it could be a race riots-esque picture from the 80s and 90s. We don't get into that really, but that's a huge conversation to be had. Latino neighborhoods. If you've ever been to a large city, you know that large cities such as Chicago, San Francisco, New York here tend to be chopped up into ethnic zones, wherein you go and the people speak the native ethnic languages and have shops and foods likewise, right? If you've never been to a large enough city to have that, I suggest you get there. Non-Indigenous languages. English, of course, is the official language. English and French, there we go, the official languages of Canada, whereas the United States technically does not have an official language, but it quote unquote does, and that it would be English. Spanglish is, there's a lot of different, what's a good way to phrase this? There's a lot of different dialects through the United States, and they sort of take bits and pieces from other languages, such as Spanglish, a combination of Spanish and English, to create their own native tongues, right? I'm sure you're very well aware of cliches of a Southern guy talking with such a deep drawl, you can't follow his words, right? That's very much a thing in every part of the world, and it is as well in the United States and Canada. You've ever heard someone speaking proper Queen's English and then British Cockney English, you can tell like there's massive dialectal differences. Both countries are predominantly Christian in religion, whereas Canada is more Roman Catholic, the United States is. They're still both Christian. Large Muslim and Jewish populations in both parts of the world. Here's your Indigenous languages map. As you can see, it's basically English everywhere. Where was the Danish at? That's a weird one. Oh, up in Greenland. That makes sense because Greenland's part of Denmark. Okay. Then you can see also here French Canada. If you've never heard of French Canada, it's the best Canada in the land. Andrew, question? Is that no question, Andrew?
No, I just had something I had mentioned to you in your chat box.
Oh, I see. Oh, sorry, I didn't see that. It's crazy what interstate highways did to the division of cultural ethnic groups in big cities, like you mentioned. Yes, we'll get to interstate highways and stuff like that in a bit. But yeah, again, right, that ties into something I say all the time, which is the fun part of geography, is it's sort of everything you can talk about geography, you would touch on it. And it's a good stepping off point to, hey, that was cool, let me learn more. That is a huge swath and a lot of stuff going on there. Religions has talked about prayer. Big swath, lots of varieties of Christian, Baptist. That's something you only really see in America, right? That Mormon map looks kind of weird. I don't think it's quite that big, but it could be. Other Christian. Apparently Alaska is very other Christian. I have no idea what that's supposed to be. But yeah, I'm sure you're aware of this. There is a growing, in the United States and Canada, non-religious component, but it's still smaller than it is over in Europe. You're talking 10-11% non-religious in the United States and Canada versus some countries such as like Sweden or Norway, 40-50% non-religious. So is a conversation we had. Economic geography. Unsurprisingly, again, if you've lived in America, you're probably well aware the United States is the world's largest economy, the world's largest producer and consumer of goods. uh, has the largest federal foreign debt, the largest national debt. And given that we only have about 5-6% of the world's population, we hold a vast, vast majority of the world's wealth. Other countries are catching up, right? China has more billionaires than any other place in the world, but there's a lot of money in this particular region, a whole lot of money. There is large amounts of poverty in the Americas. 15-20% of America is considered poor or below the poverty threshold. That being said, being poor in America is a very different conversation from being poor in other parts of the world. A person under the poverty line in America may still have a car, have a TV, have indoor plumbing, right? Poor people in other parts of the world have none of those things. So the average American, very wealthy. Where is poverty situated in America? Poverty is mostly situated in the South, specifically the Southeast, the old Confederate States. The majority of the poorest per capita states in America are your Georgia, your Alabama, your Mississippi, your Tennessee, things along those lines. As you can see here, South Dakota has very poor swaths of land, but South Dakota also has like 7 people living in it. So if you have 7 people, 2 of them are poor, right? You tend to have high poverty levels. Your wealth is mostly concentrated on the coastlines, the East Coast and the West Coast. And yeah, there's a poverty map of America. It's pretty interesting to look at this way. And this also brings up a good point I talked about at the very beginning of class, that being, what other regions have we talked about poverty maps in, right? You could tell this slideshow is made by Americans because they go into this much detail about America exclusively. Jacob, what's up?
What is like poverty defined as here? Is this like generally like less than 30,000 a year, or is it?
Yes.
Okay.
I believe there was a I can't remember the exact number. I think it's around 30,000. How much your household's income is on a yearly basis, and if it's below a certain number, then you're considered in poverty, and you have more aid and stuff like that given to you. Technically, if you guys are college students, you probably all fall below the poverty line if you don't live at home. So congratulations on that. But yeah, this would be strictly a income-based determination.
Okay, but is it different for New York City than it is here? Or if 2 people,
I
they
believe
both earn 29,000.
I believe
one
the
lives in
poverty
Houghton, one lives in
level.
New
I
York.
believe the poverty level is a strictly number determination. That being said, someone making 30,000 a year in New York, and someone making 30,000 a year in the UP probably live very different lives. So
Okay.
it's not I think I know what you're getting at. It's not how well you're living. It's strictly how much money you're bringing in on your tax returns.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Yeah, but he brings up a good point, right? Where you're living is a big determining factor of how well you're living on that money. I have friends living out in San Francisco that make $250,000 a year, and I have a better house than them. And I'm not making $250,000 a year teaching you guys this class, believe me, because I live in a particular part of the world that does not have a very high amount of money needed to buy X, Y, and Z, right? But yeah, this is strictly a by the numbers tax returns chart. Good question, though. Sources of regions' affluence, how places get wealthy. One of the key reasons why certain places are wealthier than others would be, of course, natural assets. If you live in a particular part of the world that has access to goods or products that people want, you tend to make more money, right? You also can have large populations and talent pools. Those blue colors over here in California, they represent large cities and tech cities and places where people make a lot of money, right? Same thing with why New York's all green over here, right? You tend to have mechanized economies. We talked about this a lot, and we talked about other regions. This part of the world, all part of the world is very modern. You don't have to go to work and get your knuckles dirty doing something with your hands. You can go to work and push a button and watch a computer and watch a robot do it for you. There is an overall sense of internal unity and track record of continuity in political, economical, and cultural institutions within those wealthy areas. That is something that is relevant very much so in this wonderful year of 2020. That's more apparent than it has been possibly in years past, which is that unity and track record of continuity for economic, political, and cultural institutions. If you have a particular part of the world that's doing well and continues to do well, it will continue to do well. So when we come over again to this map and we look at these green dots, those green dots have been green for quite a long time. And those brown dots have been brown again for quite a long time. This sort of institutionalized affluence, right? In America, the wealthiest 1% of Americans total about 20% of the nation's income. This is, I think, grown in recent times, again, because 2020 is just the best time to live. One of my math classes I teach, we go over the definition of a billion and how ridiculous it is to be a billionaire. Going over about how Jeff Bezos, in the particular conversation I had, makes enough money to fund you going to Harvard for 4 years, like every 15 seconds. He makes enough money to send someone to Harvard. That's a lot of money, right? And he is one of many billionaires that hold all that money. How they hold that money is an entirely different conversation. It's not Scrooge McDuck jumping into a big vault of gold coins, but yeah. We can contrast that with the poorest 10% of Americans hold less than 2% of the total economy. And again, those numbers have changed a bit, but the idea still stands that the wealthy in America and the wealthy really throughout the world hold a lot more money per person than you would probably think. And that number doesn't seem like that big of a deal, 20%. But again, Jeff Bezos in 20 seconds has made enough money to send one of you to Harvard for a 4-year scholarship. All of you could be going to Harvard right now in the time it takes me to finish this thought. That's how much money a billionaire actually has. As I said before, why does all this money exist in America and certain parts of the world? Well, regional climate biome plays a big part in that. You have large potential for production of goods that are very useful. America, this particular region, is the largest food exporting region in the world. China's catching up to us nowadays, but you have so much of America is so good at producing food, it allows us to be incredibly wealthy. On top of the food production, again, right, if you ever been to the bread belt and you've seen just hundreds and thousands of acres of nothing but wheat or corn or grazing land for cattle or something like that, that's how that works. Resource rich as well. On top of food production, you got your forests, your minerals, your energy, your oil, your natural gas reserves. Canada's world's largest exporter of wood, big forests in the region. America is a very large player in the natural gas and oil game, lots of mines, lots and lots of money here for lots and lots of different reasons, right? That's a lot of trees. And again, if you live around any of the GCC campuses, I'm sure you've seen logging trucks driving down the road. Here is the U.S. shale gas reserves. This is going in a bit more geology I'm going to cover in this conversation, but there's a lot of oil in America as well. We've talked about with Russia, with the Middle East regions, how oil is a big player in those games. Venezuela, right? Certain countries in Oceania, America and Canada also have that benefit. Tar sands in Canada shown here. Again, I'm not going to go into what tar sand is, but you can think of it as a dirty oil reserve. That's a big cutting tool, and that's little man, one of the two. One of the key factors I talked about in all the previous regions, I talk about again here, is the idea of the more developed country. What is a more developed country? A more developed country is one where people have to put in less of their own work to get out a product, your blue collar to white collar transition. Most Americans and Canadians are employed in service sectors such as finance, medical care, retail, entertainment, etc. You don't actually physically make something for your money. You provide someone with a service for your money. Manufacturing is a ever shrinking thing in a more developed country because you don't need 10 people on the line to build that car. You need 2 people on the line to make sure the robot builds that car. The car's still built the same. So the real money isn't in working on this mill. The real money, again, this is a picture of South Korea, but South Korea is in the same boat, right? You don't see people working on this line. I think maybe there's like a person right there. You don't see people working this line. You just need to have an engineer that knows how to build this and a metallurgist that knows what the final product should look like. You don't need people in there stirring the mixtures and pouring in all the side products to make the certain steel you want. United States and Canada are vital trading partners, as is Mexico, which we talked about last time. You could argue definitely Canada is more dependent on the United States than the United States is on Canada, but they both play a big deal with each other. They haven't always played nice either, funny enough. The wheat war, salmon war, lumber dumping, lots of big issues have gone on between these two countries, trying to figure out how to work with each other and how to best both grow given this very secure mutual trading relationship. NAFTA, of course, being a big component of that, and now today the USMCA. All right, we can get to the Transcontinental Railroad and the highway system. United States is big, right? We know that. Before the advent of cars, before the advent of mechanized motion, if you wanted to travel across the United States, say for the gold rush, you got yourself a covered wagon, hitched up some horses, and traveled for months. But you don't want to bring gold back that way, especially before the Panama Canal existed. So the United States built what's called the Transcontinental Railroad, which was a rail line, steam locomotive line that connected the two sides of America, allowing for quick and easy transportation across that. Then comes the automobile. I believe it was Eisenhower, I want to say. Maybe not, I can't remember. That instituted the highway system that we now all drive on every single day. America is very much a nation of highways. Look at that. That's gross, right? There are highways everywhere. If you want to get, I was right about Eisenhower, cool. If you want to get someplace, thank you, Aaron. If you want to get someplace in America, you drive there. I believe when we talked about Europe, Europe has a very large train system. Lots of Asia has very large amounts of train systems. That's not something that happens in America. Amtrak is the only government-funded rail system in America, and there's like 4 of them. And they connect a few towns, they do it poorly. You want to get someplace in America, you take a car. I'm sure you're aware of that, however. All right, let's take a step back here. Let's go over some historical connotations. Of course, American Revolution. I don't need to get too deep into what happened there, but we didn't like the taxation without representation of Britain. had over the colonies, so we fought a little teeny war over it, right? After the American Revolution, the Americans were high on their success and decided we'll take Canada too, hence the War of 1812. We didn't take Canada, and Canada emerged as a unified nation, mostly in response to America wanting more and more and more stuff, right? Well, today we are strong nations. We did pick a war with Canada because that's what we're good at. The United States in the modern day very much displays its power through military action and trade. You want to do something in America, you want to do something in the world and the financial market, you use the American dollar. You use the American dollar because America says you use the American dollar. And America tells you that by having the biggest guns, right? The classic, if you look on the back of your dollar bill, it says a Federal Reserve note. And that Federal Reserve note only has purchasing power because the Federal Reserve, which is a branch of the government, says it does. Today, the United States is still arguably the sole superpower. I wouldn't argue that anymore. At the time of the slideshow, maybe. But in today's 2020, China is very much a superpower right alongside us. We are, of course, still dominant in pop culture. We have some of the world's best universities. We spend way more money in the military than any other part of the world. A lot of that goes to other countries, too, as we talked about, let's say, the Middle East and Israel. And, yeah, the UN is in New York. I mean, so let's go over a couple quick little bullet points so that we can end this conversation. If you want to stay afterwards, talk about the final project and that whole rigmarole, feel free to. I can talk about that. But let's talk about Quebec. In case you weren't aware, Quebec wants to be its own country. I know, it seems kind of weird, right? But Quebec was one of the earliest European settlements in Canada. In 1763, they had a major British victory, resulting in broad, sweeping British language throughout the country. But Quebec is still dominantly French, even after that British military victory. 82%, as of the slideshow, Quebecers, whatever you call them, prefer to speak French. This is French Canada. After World War II, there was a very large push by, however you pronounce that word, the PQ, we'll say, to cede from Canada and gain independence because Canada is... Aaron, you got a question?
Yeah, I had a question. I don't know if I'm jumping the gun here, but I have a friend of mine who lives in Alberta, and he made a comment that not just that, Quebec wants to be its own nation. Apparently, it's a big source of, I don't know, they like to make fun of Quebec, but that's beside the point. Like, he made a comment, I haven't really looked too much into it, about how Quebec actually does rely on quite a bit of financial funding from the Canadian government. Why is it like a rational decision for them to leave the country of Canada? I don't know if I'm jumping the gun here, but maybe you'll explain it later. But that's just the questions I'm getting right now.
So I'm not privy to these conversations, right? I'm not Canadian or Quebecian, whatever you would call it. But I think the key word in that conversation you said was rational. A lot of these conversations aren't based on rationality. They're based on feelings and camaraderie and patriotism and things along those lines. You hear rumors, for example, of people saying that the Upper Peninsula of Michigan should be its own state. And to give a parallel for that, and that would be a very, very bad idea because we would by far and away be the poorest state in the
Absolutely.
United States, right? The UP is like what 5% of Michigan's economy. We wouldn't survive otherwise. But people in the UP want to be their own state because of Yooper pride. I think that would be a driving factor for this Quebec conversation more so than anything else. Quebec is people in Quebec that want to be separate from Canada feel that they're not Canadian. So why should we be Canadian?
I see. Thank you.
No problem. And on that note, this isn't something isolated to Quebec. I think every 2 or 3 years you hear about someone in Texas trying to have a petition for Texas to be its own state. Not a unique
That's
thing
true.
at all, right? Yeah.
I have something.
Yep.
I thought I heard on a website or some other stuff about the UP being its own state. I thought it was partially because of it, not just because of UP pride, but also because they were trying to avoid a lot of the environmentalist policies that were being.
Oh, I could definitely believe it. Yeah. Again, I'm not a UP by itself sort of person, right? But you will have justifications, X, Y, and Z justification as to why you think this is a good idea. However, it's noteworthy that since America formed, not a single state has successfully seceded apart from the Civil War, which they failed at seceding, right? These sort of conversations always die upon further inspection for that exact reason. So, and they also die with Quebec. I mean, we can look at Catalonia in Spain, I think in 2018 or something like that. They wanted to secede from Spain, a little island at the south of Spain, and they actually fought a little battle over it. Like I think the Spanish police was sent in and the army, and they had a little fight over there because this little island nation wanted to secede, and they eventually failed. This is not an unusual thing. Africa goes through this all the time. It's just how strong is the government to keep it enforced. Andrew Olson comments down here. There are high-speed rails built here in California, between Anaheim and San Francisco, Seattle and Vancouver, Texas. Yeah, there are a lot of trains in America. You're right, Andrew. I'm talking about.
Yeah.
I was talking about specifically about Amtrak, which is not private, which is publicly funded.
Yeah, that's another thing that I have a question about.
Yes.
With the whole California high-speed rail that they're trying to build.
Yes.
They pretty much ran out of funding as of right now.
Sounds about right.
And the Texas line that they're trying to build is private to try.
Yes.
Like rail service versus private.
I'm sorry, you skipped out a little bit there. Could you repeat that, please?
Yeah. What's the difference? What's the difference between, like, what's your personal opinion on having private rail service compared to public?
So the public versus private rail service would be analogous to public versus private highways, toll roads, essentially. The reason why the highway system in America looks the way it does is because the government decided to build it. And when the government decides to build it, they're not looking for a profit margin. They're looking to give access to all these different places. So a private rail service, for example, is only going to take, without a doubt, the most profitable routes, which could leave out large swaths of people that the government may, for example, send rail to. Again, I can use an example of the highway system. I'll use an example of the highway system in the UP. If you leave Houghton and you travel to Marquette, there's lots of 4-lane highways. There's not a lot of people taking these highways. You could very easily have built that as a 55-mile-an-hour one on each side road, not a highway, and you really wouldn't lose a lot of the traffic. And if someone was paying for that, they probably wouldn't have built the large highways connecting, again, say, Ontonagon to Houghton and what have you. It simply isn't the money to support that stuff. But the United States government thought it was worthwhile to connect these towns, so they did. That's the main argument. Yeah, no problem. That's the main argument between the two. What else we got is Quebec, Atlantic region. Yeah, this is something of interest. If you ever get, when you think of Canada, you usually don't think of Newfoundland, Labrador, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island. These are very unique, very interesting parts of Canada that I think are well worth your exploration. When my kids old enough, we want one of our first big family vacations to be to Newfoundland and Labrador, because they are exciting, interesting places to be. Very large fisheries, tens of thousands of fishers and fisheries, producing cod and all these various fish stocks that are somewhat unique and interesting. I don't know, not a whole lot to talk about this region, but if you never looked into and read up about Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, well worth your time. The Arctic, not much to say about the Arctic. It's a bunch of ice up there, some polar bears sadly dying because of global warming. There was a big push back in the day by Russia to get some sort of northwest Arctic passage, connecting North Russia to Canada and Greenland and Finland and what have you. Never really went anywhere, sadly. It's hard to drive through ice. A lot of gas and oil in this particular region that's worth discussing, but it's also really hard to get to, as I said before. Greenland, right? Everyone knows the old story. They called Iceland and Greenland because they didn't want people going to Iceland, so they called it Iceland. What fun. Geologically, it's part of North America, but it's actually a Danish province, and it's the world's largest island, funny enough. Not a lot of people live there, and it's cold, and you only go there for science. What else do we got here? Walmart, something interesting to talk about. Everyone's, I'm sure, heard the conversation about the dying of the small town, the Walmart effect. If you can't compete with Walmart's low prices, if you ever get a chance to watch The High Cost of Low Prices, the documentary, it'll ruin your day about why Walmart is so cheap. Worth considering. Funny enough, the most expansive company, the company with the most branches in America, is I think actually Dollar General. Because I mean, have you ever been to a town that didn't have a dollar store in it? Right? Well, Dollar General has kind of overtaken Walmart as the people that all these small towns get their stuff from. Aaron, question?
No, I just wanted to comment a bit on that. Like, you make such a great point about Dollar General. When you were talking about the death of the small town, I was about to type in chat. That's what Dollar General is for. But, like,
Yeah,
here in the Midwest, especially where it's kind of harder to get goods up here by truck and stuff, it's a lot easier to supply a Dollar General than it is
Yes.
to
Yep.
supply like a super mall like Walmart. I think that's partially why they're kind of really popular. I'm
Yeah.
not surprised about that at all.
No, that's 100% accurate. Good point. The sense, yeah, Dollar General has the infrastructure to provide what small town businesses used to provide, but in a Walmart style corporate setting. Where, and again, part of the reason Walmart gets their stuff so cheap is, for example, they own their own trucks, and they own their own distribution center, and they own their own factories in China. Well, not China anymore, but they own their own factories outside of America where they can make that shoe for 5 cents. So Dollar General has taken this idea, but then shrunk it down into a dollar store size. So yeah, very much a thing. People ebb and flow around America. I think this is something I don't think we need to go much into here. But yeah, this goes into the ex-urbanization. Most people that you talk to that live in cities don't want to live in cities. And that's sort of a byproduct of America being so urban for so long that every other region we talked about, excluding Europe, people are leaving the rural and moving to the cities in vast swaths. America has sort of a negative approach to that, where lots of people that live in cities in America want to get out of the cities, as shown here, right? If you look over here, Los Angeles and San Francisco are not in the green, they're in the white. Yeah, Ontonagon, it would be a good example of that, Andrew, wherein people left the cities and moved towards more outlying regions simply because there was no benefit to the cities anymore. New York and San Francisco being an example of this conversation nowadays, but they are still both very, very large, very, very big cities, right? New York City is the largest city in the United States by population. If you just include city proper, I think Los Angeles has like a bigger population, but it's more spread out, so it's hard to call it all a city. Yeah, I'm not going to go too deep into New York and San Francisco. I get the feeling you've seen a movie or two about one of these cities, right? Drought and water is a big issue in the west coast and the west side of the United States. Essentially, this kind of ties back into the bottled water catastrophe going on, but since we talked about before, right, the West is basically all a desert, and the largest source of water out there is the Colorado River. So when you have, for example, climate change happen, less snow melts off the Rockies to feed the Colorado River, less water flows through, you have people that have an issue getting that water. Add on top of that the damming for hydroelectric purposes of the water, and you really have a large issue with people having enough water to grow what they need to grow and survive the way they need to survive. And then couple that with the fact that we live in America and everyone wants a big, nice green lawn, you have vast swaths of the water in the West going to things like watering lawns or vineyards for expensive wines, whereas people are having problems finding water for their showers and their cooking. So that's an oddly ongoing thing. Us in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan don't know what that's like, but yeah, there's parts of America where water is a big issue. This right here is a byproduct of the slideshow. They're talking about Hurricane Katrina. Was a big issue, not so relevant in 2020. There's other big events that have happened. The hurricane in Puerto Rico, for example, will be something you'll be talking about then. But yeah, this also ties into the ridiculous amount of natural disasters that we have in America because of our varied biome and climate. Yes.
Where in the Southwest in America are they actually? Because I have heard about restrictions on using water on your lawn.
Yes.
Where is that actually located? Do you know?
This would be in your larger cities like Phoenix or something like that, where you have bigger cities in California, Vegas, obviously Reno, something like that, where you have these where you have the entirety of the Southwest has a water issue, partly due to damming, but mostly due to climate change, and simply there not being as much water as there was previously. You're drying up reservoirs, things along those lines. And then you have an issue wherein, right, we're a capitalist society, you pay for what you get. So if you have enough money to buy up the water, you technically use it however you want. So when Nestle goes and builds a plant in Oregon and starts soaking up groundwater, that doesn't leave water for the rest of the people. Likewise, if you're a millionaire and you want your lawn to be nice and green, you can afford to buy up enough water to do that. Well, that leaves a lot of other people with less water that have more pressing importance for it. So I can't, off the top of my head, I couldn't name a specific, location where this is a concern, but it is a day-to-day factor that goes on in these arid climates. And it's funny that in America, we have these arguments about people shouldn't be watering their lawns, where again, in Africa, it's the same climate, but no one's got water. So very much a thing. I guess I think this is the last slide. Yeah, we can end on the ANWR, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. This ties a little bit into something I think this slideshow should have done more on, which is the national parks thing that Theodore Roosevelt started. Very much a unique facet of America. We have a lot of land in America that we deem significant in and of itself. This is Yellowstone, right? And the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge would be another example of that. This, I believe, is up in Alaska. And it's a large swath of land that the government deemed shouldn't be touched, should be left as nature. And then they found out a lot of oil was there. So there's been a constant debate of should we tear up this land for oil or should we let it be as is? Again, another conversation to be had, but this is not unique to ANWR. This is kind of everywhere. Aaron?
Yeah, I know this is a bit off topic, but isn't there a way for them to extract it off the land without actually, I don't know, destroying everything? I guess I'm a bit unfamiliar with the idea.
There are many ways to extract natural resources, such as oil, yes. The problem is how much money do you want to spend to do it? The cheapest way to get out natural resources is also the dirtiest way. So, and at some point that oil's not worth getting if it costs a lot to get it. And these conversations focus very much on trying to figure out the cheapest way to get the oil out. And that usually conflicts with keeping the area pristine. Again, I could use the Upper Peninsula as an example. We still have a lot of copper up here, but the amount of money it would cost to take it out and not damage the environment makes the copper not worth taking out. So it'd be the same conversation. All right, so that concludes chapter 11, and that also concludes lectures for the class. I will stop the recording, then we can, if you want, we can talk about the presentations. It's up to you.